we should be constantly scrutinizing methodologies, constantly scrutinizing rules and guidance to make sure that it is generating, in my opinion, the most important thing in the market, which is accuracy. So what we're really looking for, if you ask my opinion, is not a sort of nebulous concept of integrity, but it's actually a very hard concept of accuracy.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Are you passionate about climate action and staying on top of the latest trends in the world of carbon capture, removal, and markets? Then the Carbon Herald has you covered. Every week, we bring you the top news, breakthroughs, and insights from the world of carbon management, delivered straight to your inbox. No fluff, no jargon, just the essential info you need to stay informed. So whether you're a climate professional or just someone who cares, make sure you're subscribed. Visit carbonherald.com and sign up today for our weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by Nick Marshall, chair of the Project Developer Forum, a global network and collective voice for over 60 companies and practitioners dedicated to developing and financing carbon credit projects. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on this show, and I'm very excited for today's episode. Before we get into all of the carbon matters, so to speak, we really like to get a kind of a feel for our guest background first. So it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about what you used to do before the Project Developer Forum and what essentially brought you to this space to begin with.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Violet. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast. This is my second podcast, so it's still quite a novel experience for me.
Okay.
I've been involved in the carbon market for over 20 years. I started my career in the early days of the EU ETS, originating projects under the Clean Development Mechanism. And I've been working in the industry ever since. And originally, I was more on the trading side, so originating and selling credits from the CDM. But since about 2019, I set up a company called Task with some old colleagues from the market, and we did that to sort of take advantage of the opportunities that we saw being developed under the Paris Agreement and also the voluntary carbon market. And we've been at that now for 7 years. It's gone by in a flash, but and we're sort of project developers now. So we focus on channeling investment into good project ideas and actually delivering them ourselves. So we develop them ourselves physically on the ground, and obviously sell the resultant credits to sort of get a return on investment for our portfolio of investors. And obviously, as a part of that activity, I've always been extremely supportive of the Project Developer Forum, which has been running, I think, since 2009. And I, because it's super important for us that project developers have a voice in the development of regulation in the market effectively. I think,
of course,
I think often I get the feeling that sometimes, we are seen as sort of rule takers. We can't, there's not a huge amount of influence that we can have. But of course, the Project Developer Forum contains more than 60 companies, as you said, and they're from all over the world, and they're out there implementing these projects under various methodologies in various countries, and they have genuinely the best sort of insight into how the technicalities of project development work. And so I think it's really important that resource of knowledge is not lost in the process. And so the Project Developer Forum really focuses on that, is getting our voice heard in the relevant sort of policy development forums, or with the standards, or various industry actors.
Excellent. So a champion of project developers of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing is that we're not, that's right, but we're all, it's a voluntary kind of affair. So no one's getting paid in the Project Developer Forum. It's like, it's everyone sort of banding together with a common interest, right? So there's no one championing anyone else. It's very much a collective effort.
So, given the sheer number of project developers you work with, and like as you mentioned, this amount of knowledge that they gather, you have a very unique perspective of how the voluntary carbon market is developing. And I'm very curious to learn how you're seeing things. Like, what would you say has changed, particularly on the supply side in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, it's the VCM specifically is difficult, right? Because that's always the problem with voluntary initiatives in any in any sector you choose to pick, because it's based on sentiment largely, and often sentiment can be sort of created and removed in a quicker space of time as you could possibly conceive. And so round about 2020, 2021, sort of at the end of the pandemic, sort of during the pandemic and at the end of the pandemic, there was a huge wave of sentiment to undertake voluntary action related to, corporates and various bodies who sort of generated a lot of demand for what we were doing, the projects and essentially compensating for their emissions. But unfortunately, that sentiment was not sustainable. And I think once economic headwinds start to become a little bit stronger, then a lot of companies tend to pull away. And also, as in inevitably, when you get a wave of activity, as we saw at that time, it brings with it a lot of scrutiny and a lot of media scrutiny. And there was an awful lot of that taking place. And it became very prevalent that some of the standards or some of the projects were being scrutinized, and obviously there were some unfortunate situations with certain projects where there was some malpractice going on, and that effectively caused the combination of things effectively caused a bit of a loss of confidence in the market. And unfortunately, that is very difficult to bring back. And so what you've seen is a bit of a roller coaster in terms of price and demand in the voluntary carbon market, which has left us now in the position where it's not growing. It's basically flatlined for the last, 3 or 4 years. And what a lot of developers are now looking towards is a more compliance-led market. So effectively implementing the Paris Agreement as it was envisaged and starting to see compliance-led demand coming back into the market.
Have you seen these, like, kind of this, turbulence and scrutiny in the VCM also affect developer confidence? As far as, like, have you seen developers, kind of pull out of carbon credit schemes or anything of the sort?
We developers are an optimistic bunch, I feel, and I think we have to be. And I think that developers themselves don't tend to sort of pull out, if you like, of schemes. What happens, unfortunately, in some situations is that developers just basically run out of money. If they can't sell their credits or they can't sell them at the price they predicted that they were going to be able to sell them at, then insolvencies are starting to take place. And that's the honest reality that we see, is a lot of developers really struggling now because of the lack of, like I said before, the lack of sustainable demand and pricing at a level that actually can support, certain project types.
So again, as far as confidence goes, you mentioned very correctly that there's like this move towards more integrity, more regulation. And have been like a number of moves, especially in the last year, to boost transparency and integrity in carbon markets, like from the ICVCM, from standards and others. How, from a developer standpoint, are these reforms kind of landing on the ground? Yeah,
so I think the first thing to say on that is that project developers are extremely supportive of these initiatives. Effectively, I think, but what shouldn't be lost in this whole discussion is that this has been a process that's gone on for the last 20 years, right? So the carbon market has not been, it's effectively been in a constant state of evolution. And as we sit today, new initiatives coming in, possibly off the back of some of the misdemeanors that I mentioned previously, that are sort of indicating that, okay, we need to bring integrity into the market, right? The problem with that is that, of course, it seems to then suggest that there was no integrity prior to these initiatives taking place. And that's the bit that I struggle with a little bit, because basically one of the examples I often use is that one of the first renewable energy methodologies under the CDM is now on sort of version 28 or something. So this thing has been evolved over many years. Improvements have taken place. Experts have fed back into the process. So there has always been a constant evolution in the market of, if what I put in real inverted commas, integrity. I have a little bit of a problem with the word integrity, because I think integrity can mean a different thing to every person you ask, right? We know what lacking integrity is, for sure, but to sort of suggest that what's taking place now is as integrity and what happened before does not. That's a bit of an issue. That's a problem that I have. But yeah, in general terms, I'm extremely supportive of that evolutionary process, right? Is that we should be constantly scrutinizing methodologies, constantly scrutinizing rules and guidance to make sure that it is generating, in my opinion, the most important thing in the market, which is accuracy. So what we're really looking for, if you ask my opinion, is not a sort of nebulous concept of integrity, but it's actually a very hard concept of accuracy, which is that a ton is a ton is a ton. So if you're accounting for emissions reductions from projects or even from like corporate emissions, whatever, is that you can be as sure as you possibly can be. The science is often not entirely exact in various sort of applications of projects or whatever. You have to try and be as sure as you can be that a ton is a ton is a ton. So that there's accuracy in that accounting process. And I think that for me is the most important thing that we should be talking about. Because when you apply a label of integrity, you're kind of sort of, it's for me, it's going a little bit off topic in some regards, because I think actually we should be focusing on accuracy.
So accuracy being like robust methodologies and then someone to monitor them or watch them be enforced essentially, or put their seal of approval.
It's a whole process, right? But this is, like I said before, this is a process that has been established for about 20 years. So what we're trying to do is just refine that process depending on the type of activity you're doing to such a degree that you can be sure that the accounting of those emissions reductions and which incorporates the monitoring, which incorporates the auditing, the certification, the whole thing is as accurate as it can possibly be. Because I think that's the thing that gives everyone confidence. I think the thing that sort of buyers will, when they lose confidence is when they don't believe that they're buying what they think is a ton of CO2 that's been reduced or removed, and actually it turns out that it wasn't. It was actually only half a ton or something. Do you know what I mean? That's the problem. That's where they lose confidence, because I guess they feel they've been ripped off, right? So
absolutely, yes.
Ultimately, you want to focus on that accuracy. I think that's what these guys are doing. I genuinely do, and that's why I sort of reiterate that we're extremely supportive of that process. That's what needs to happen. We need to have this continuous evolution towards a great degree of accuracy. But what I don't like is sort of the labeling of stuff that's gone previously as being effectively lower in integrity. It's just that it's not. It's just an evolutionary process, and I feel like what needs to happen is that we work together to, as I said before, that project developers feed into that process so that the standards makers or whoever we're talking to have a really clear understanding of what it means to implement a project on the ground, right? That's the most crucial thing, because that's where the emissions reductions are being generated.
Yes. Kind of in line with what you just said about like older projects not being less transparent or whatever. This is an evolutionary process, should be treated as such. I know that you guys recently wrote an open letter to Gold Standard warning that retroactive application of climate rules to existing carbon projects might turn out to be essentially more harmful than beneficial. Could you please tell us more about this issue and perhaps the open letter itself?
Yeah, sure. So again, it's important to reiterate here that we're not against what in general is being done, particularly in this case by the gold standard, right? Aligning with the Paris Agreement in and of itself is what I believe we should be doing, and what I think most of our members believe should be happening. The problem is the way that it's done. Traditionally in the market, projects are developed along the lines of having crediting periods, right? So under the gold standard, it's a 5-year crediting period. So effectively what you do is you establish your project, you fix a baseline, you fix your monitoring procedures, you fix, even in the project design, the methodology type and the methodology version. And then you go out and you get investment for that project. And you're able, on the back of that as a developer, to effectively build an investment case for investors, which is based on how they're going to get a return on investment, right? And that's a function of effectively the number of emissions reductions you're going to achieve against what you hope to get as a market price. And traditionally, those sort of crediting periods have been sacrosanct, effectively. So you fix everything at the start of a crediting period, you run your project for 5 years, and then you have to renew that crediting period effectively. And at that point of renewal, what tends to happen is that, well, what not tends to happen, it absolutely happens, is that you review what the developments have been in the last 5 years related to those methodologies or those standards, and you update your project. If there's been, like I said, if a new methodology version has been published, you have to apply that with its perhaps more conservative estimates or more accurate estimates of emissions reductions, and then you sort of build another investment case for an additional monitoring period. Now, if what's happened recently, unfortunately, is that seems to have gone out the window, is that projects are now being told to effectively update their project documentation in the middle of their crediting periods. So a project gets itself registered, it gets all its investment in the door, and then 2 years later it says, actually, you need to rewrite all of that stuff and redo your baselines and redo everything, and good luck, basically. But obviously that then puts you in a position where your business model that you built for that 5-year crediting period gets thrown out the window, and your investors start looking at you and say, hang on a minute, you told us that this was going to happen, but now you're having to write down the impact of this project considerably because of these rule changes. And that's basically the nightmare scenario for a business. I don't know whether it doesn't even have a project developer, like it's a nightmare scenario for a business. That effectively you're being told that you're generating 20% less product than you anticipated you would, but your costs remain the same, right? You probably wouldn't have made the same investment decision at the time if you knew that was going to happen. And that's where the problem lies. It's not what's being proposed. It's how the implementation of it's being proposed. Because, like I said, that can actually mean the difference between life or death for a project, effectively. And that's hugely problematic, because as a principle, that's not how it used to work in the carbon market, effectively. So what we're really saying with the letter is we support what you're doing, we support the alignment process, but can we revert to the original situation where projects that are in their existing crediting periods only have to apply these new rules once they renew their crediting periods, which is probably like in 2 or 3 years or whatever it is for each project. I don't think it's not that controversial a thing to be asking, and it really can make financially the difference, make or break for the project in question.
It's not. It's definitely not too much to ask. And in fact, I have some good news because we did reach out to Gold Standard for a comment. And in response, they assured us that there would not be any retroactive claims. The updated requirements will apply only to future projects. So that essentially does away with that main concern right there. Hopefully.
Well, I can tell you that I'm having I'd also like to say that we have a great relationship with the Gold Standard. I personally have had a great relationship with all the guys there. I think they do a wonderful job. They're instrumental in some of the real innovations in the market, new methodologies, bringing on new project types. I've worked with them for a long time now. And, I'm talking to Maggie, their CEO, this week. And perhaps to have these conversations in public is not always the most comfortable way of doing things, but sometimes I guess it's necessary on behalf of our members to kind of make these issues public. But we do in general have a really good working relationship with those guys.
Well, it is in line with all of our desire for more transparency, as we've been consistently talking about in this conversation about the VCM. So as far as having more transparency goes, I think it's important that these conversations be had in public as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's, yeah, it can be somewhat awkward sometimes, but it's the right thing to do.
I think it's all good in the end. So, but moving back to like some of the issues that developers face today, I was also curious to find out what are the biggest barriers actually for bringing high quality projects to market. Whether that is it permitting, is it financing, is it methodology approval? What would you say is like the biggest roadblock?
I feel like this is an easy answer, and I hope it's not too obvious, but it's demand. Once you have demand, maybe the caveat is demand with a discoverable price level that is reasonable. I don't know, I know you're going to ask me what reasonable is. I can't answer that question, but for sure, you need demand, right? I mean, the one thing that, if you look back over the history of the carbon market, the one thing that you can absolutely put your finger on with complete certainty is that once demand starts to build, then project-based activity will grow. It follows it very, very closely. And likewise, once demand sort of shrivels, then projects wither on the vine, or you don't get new projects coming on with the same level, and that's the crucial thing. So as we sit today, I feel like we're in a globally, let's say, in a bit of a limbo, in that there are sort of the beginnings of some demand signals coming from some corners of the market that project developers are getting excited about, but don't want to get ahead of themselves on, because they know that there can always be things that prevent them happening. I'll give you the obvious example, which is Corsia, the airline industry's initiative to deal with their emissions. And, that's been on the table for many years, and people have been looking at, certainly project developers have been looking at it for many years and thinking, well, here looks like a really certain and large source of new demand that could come to the market. And, we are starting to sort of gather ourselves to try and meet that demand. It's not easy, because there are a lot of hurdles, both on the project development side and also on the policy side, to ensure that you can develop projects that will meet all the criteria of Corsia. But it looks like it's going to happen. And, there's certainly some kind of pioneers out there who are doing great work. And I mean, in the project development side, who are sort of aligning their projects with national approvals from the host party governments and meeting the requirements of Corsia, so that, they will have a source of supply that can go into that market. But it's it's also, it's still tricky, right? There's still sort of some question marks hanging over the Corsair in general. And that's sort of really goes from geopolitical kind of question marks around what the US will do, for example, all the way down to, can you get, a permit for your project at the host party level just to go ahead and implement it. So I think people are excited by these types of new markets, but they don't want to get too ahead of themselves. They don't want to sort of, put millions and millions of dollars into an investment into them, because there's still a little bit of uncertainty around how it's actually going to work.
So, follow-up question in that case. Since demand is the biggest issue, how do we solve that? Is the answer that we need like more government involvement, more compliance in the markets? The convergence of voluntary and compliance markets has been something ongoing and everybody's talking about. But how do you see it from your perspective? Like, what is the answer?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll talk to you principally about our experience with Task rather than necessarily the PD forum, because I can't talk for all the other developers out there. But, our view and my view certainly is that we definitely need more compliance schemes. So Corsair is effectively a compliance scheme. We at Task, we work in South Africa, which has a carbon tax, which has generated another domestic compliance scheme there. And we see how once you implement these types of programs and everyone has some certainty around how they're going to work, the rules are clear, the approval processes are clear, and the demand is clear, then it's incredible how activity picks up. And we've sort of ridden a bit of a wave of that in South Africa. It's enabled us to develop two really big, exciting projects down there that have basically met some of the demand in that country. And I think that's people need to look at those types of schemes and see how they work and say, actually, this is the sort of template that we can use. I think the real game changer, and this is coming from someone who worked in the EU ETS way back, EU ETS 1, maybe, if you like, way back in the day, is that if the EU ETS or the EU starts to let in credits again from Article 6 projects, you'll start to see another big source of demand come to the market, and that would be extremely exciting. I never thought that would actually happen again. For various reasons, I felt the EU had become entrenched in its position around utilizing effectively offset credits, but it seems like the tide might be turning on that front, and that would be really exciting. But again, timeframes are always problematic, because it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? So it's probably going to be into the next decade before we actually see anything like that coming materializing. And it's difficult to kind of hang around that long as a project developer and sort of say, okay, we're gunning for that date, but you don't have much certainty as to whether that's going to actually happen. But so to answer your question directly, is that yes, absolutely, more compliance mechanisms are needed. I think in general terms, and you talk about climate policy, if you want companies to actually address their emissions, it's only going to happen through compliance programs. As I said before, there's too much sort of fickleness in the voluntary market for them to be truly effective. I think the voluntary market's great. I think it does a great job as acting as a test bed for new initiatives for companies to understand how they address their emissions and all that stuff. But if you're going to deal with the problem, which is climate change in general, and the emissions that we're producing, only compliance schemes work.
So on that note, on like solving climate change in general, I've noticed that there's a fixation of sorts on removals only, as opposed to like nature-based solutions. Like we've seen all these major deals with like tech giants, Microsoft, Google, whatever, buying these millions of tons of carbon removals. So as any extreme, there's risks to that type of thinking, like focus on removals only. I was curious as to how you see this.
Somewhat problematic, if you like, if I can say that, because I think it's what we need is everything all at once, right? And I think those big tech companies are the one guys who can afford to pay the price point for those new technologies that are generating carbon removals. It's never going to be applicable for the whole of the market. It's just too expensive, basically. And to exclude nature-based solutions, I think, would be a huge failure, because they are, the best proven way to actually sequester carbon in a cost-effective way at scale. And I think that's what we need to do, right? Like I said, we need everything, and we need mitigation as well, right? I think, it's like I said, I think it's great that those guys with the deep pockets are developing those kind of frontier methodologies and projects that are delivering, carbon removals. But it's not, at this stage in the game, at least, it's not applicable for everyone, because it's just too expensive. So we've got to have the whole range of options on the table, so that those who don't have such deep pockets can also engage and, engage in a meaningful way, which is, nature-based solutions and mitigation.
So what do you think a more balanced kind of impact-driven portfolio would look like?
Look, that's not really for me to say, if I'm honest. That's for companies themselves to make the decision. And our experience with working with some sort of blue chip companies is that they tend to mix up and I'm not talking about the tech guys here, but like they tend to sort of mix their portfolios, where they'll do, they have a budget and they'll do X% of removals, X% MBS and some mitigation. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. And as prices start to fluctuate, they can sort of change those proportions that they're using. But I think no one should be. I don't think anyone is, if I'm honest. But you shouldn't be criticised for using mitigation credits. They're absolutely effective at reducing emissions in the way that any other is. So, I think it's like I said, this is a decision for companies themselves, based on what how much money they can throw at this. And like I said, I think it's great that the ones with the deep pockets are focusing solely on those removals technologies. But for others, it's going to be a different blend.
Mm-hmm. Kind of in that line of thought, I also wanted to ask what your observations are of how buyers behave now, like how their behavior has changed. Like we discussed the lack of confidence, that is clear. But have you noticed any other changes in buyer behavior? Like what are buyers looking for the most in a project?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's still, even when, like, it does vary when you talk about either voluntary or compliance markets here. But I think that there is still quite a focus on co-benefits. I think that if your project tells a great story in terms of delivering impact to communities or to the environment beyond just CO2 mitigation, that I think that still goes a long way to encourage buyers to get on board, right? I mean, I think they still like to put those stories on their website. They like to show that the money that they're spending is going beyond just carbon mitigation. And so I think there's still a strong emphasis in the market on those types of projects that do deliver impact beyond CO2 mitigation. So, I think the co-benefits that go towards societal impacts are particularly well appreciated and respected in the market. And I know from our perspective that those are the types of projects that we look for as well, that we like to do. I mean, I think that's also, developers have a choice, right? They can decide which types of projects they focus on, and from our perspective, I know when I talk to my management team that everyone gets the most sort of enthusiastic about the co-benefits. I mean, I don't like to say that we sort of take the emissions reductions for granted, but when you go out into farming communities and you see how a project has improved their livelihoods and in general their lives, I think that's such a wonderful thing. And it then when you're selling that type of project, you don't have to like put on a front or anything, because you're being genuine about how you feel about that project, because you have a lot of your own personal sort of enthusiasm invested in it. And I think that comes through a lot when we talk to buyers, is that they want to come and see them as well. They want to come into the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa and see how communities have been impacted by these projects. And I think that's a wonderful thing, right? And we always encourage that.
Absolutely, yes, that is definitely a wonderful thing, and it's great to hear that project developers themselves are very much focused on that, and that kind of lead with the co-benefits, which is fantastic. Not forgetting the emissions, of course. But looking ahead, like kind of based on your experience so far, what types of projects do you expect to dominate the next wave of carbon markets? And like what's currently underdeveloped but has a lot of potential?
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously it is sort of driven a little bit by the market, but I think it's still, because of all the uncertainties that I've talked about, I think in our conversation, I think there's still a focus on projects that can deliver emissions reductions at a lower price level. That's where I think developers will still focus for the sort of short to medium term, because no one knows exactly how pricing is going to look like 5 years down the line. No one knows what demand's necessarily going to look like 5 years down the line. So one of the risk mitigations you can take is to look for the lowest cost mitigation. Maybe not the lowest, but sort of like the other lower end of the scale. Like I say, if you imagine removals are at the top end of the scale, but the sort of demand for those extremely expensive removals is actually relatively low. Although they're priced very high, the sort of overall demand is probably significantly lower than probably emissions reductions that are generated at a lower cost level. And so I think, if you put me on the spot, I think nature-based solutions will be of vital importance to that initiative. So, those are the types of projects that you can scale, and if you do scale, obviously you get the economies of scale, and that generates emissions reductions at a lower cost level. And I think those are the types of projects that will continue to be developed. Of course, they're not necessarily accepted into all markets, right? So at the moment, Corsia isn't looking to accept NBS necessarily from certain of the major standards, and so then you're looking at, okay, what are some of the energy related projects that you can develop at a lower cost, and cook stoves always come up in that conversation. Even post some of the new methodologies that have been developed and the new accounting protocols that have been developed for cook stoves, which has reduced the number of emissions reductions that are generated from those types of projects. I think they'll still be quite attractive for example, for Corsia, if there's a corresponding price increase, because the one way that you can mitigate the reduction in the number of emissions reductions that are being claimed from the projects is by obviously a corresponding increase in the price that you can sell the credits for. So I think that it's highly likely that those types of projects will continue to be popular and attractive, and that they'll find their way into Corsia.
Hopefully.
Yeah. we've been working in Zimbabwe on a cookstove project with some partners of ours there, and it's really difficult, right? Although the Zimbabwean government has been very collaborative and actually supportive of creating a market in Zimbabwe. It's been really tricky. They have a really good registry, like a blockchain based registry that was developed. They've created a linkage with the gold standard. Gold standard has a linkage with ICAO and to enable credits to flow into Corsair. But even so, there's still a blockage in the system for a real basic technicality around the fact that credits have to flow backwards and forwards out of Zimbabwe, which means that they're not yet approved for Corsair. So, like, even when it looks like you've got it all lined up, and even when it looks like everything's been sorted out, you can still throw up these strange anomalies that need to be cleared up. But yeah, I think over the course of this year, that's what's going to happen. I think there'll be a lot more of these anomalies in the market that will get sorted out. Governments will start getting a little bit of confidence that they can approve projects. Because they have to look at their own accounting protocols, right, and to make sure that they're going to meet their NDCs and that they don't authorize too many emissions reductions that get exported. So I think a little bit of sort of this year will be a bit of tightening up of all of those rules, of all of those relationships between the standards and the compliance markets, which I'm optimistic we'll start to see credits flowing in a meaningful way, particularly into Corsair.
All right, Nick, I have one final question left for you before we wrap up, and that is what the Project Developer Forum and Task, for that matter, have planned for the next year, maybe, or maybe even the near future. So are there any upcoming developments that you can share with us right now?
Look, I think the PD Forum is, we're somewhat reactive, right? Like we're not trying to necessarily set an agenda. We tend to react to things as they, and input into things as they are developed. We have ongoing conversations with IATA, for example, with the ICVCM, with all of the standards. And so we're discussing a whole range of issues at any one time. And actually, it's not always that those are sort of necessarily publicized. There's a lot of sort of stakeholder consultations that we're engaged in and all this kind of stuff. So, I can't give you we don't have a fixed agenda, let's say, for 2026 at the PD Forum. We sort of we meet every week and we discuss what's going on, and we try and identify where we think we can bring value and influence the market. And that's effectively how we work. From our perspective at Task, we're still sort of all systems go in South Africa. We've got a lovely office in Cape Town and a great bunch of people who are developing some wonderful projects down there. We've got some new ideas that we're hoping to bring to the market. And equally, we're trying to, hopefully we'll crack this Corsair nut and we'll start to get credits, moving hopefully from Zimbabwe and Zambia and even Uganda, I think, into Corsair, which would be a really great moment, I think, for us.
Absolutely, it sounds very exciting, and I definitely wish you all the best with that and the most success, and hopefully all these things can manifest into reality this year.
Yeah, well, you better come back at the end of the year and ask me.
Okay, we have a deal.
I hope I'm as enthusiastic then.
Let's do it. Excellent. Nick, thank you so much for this wonderful chat. It was a pleasure to finally get to meet you in person, actually, as we've published a few of your opinion pieces. So for those listening, you're welcome to check those out on the Carbon Herald website. So again, thank you so much for your time, and I wish you a very, very successful year ahead.
Thanks very much, Violet. I enjoyed it very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.